September 1918, New York. You are standing on Fifth Avenue looking at the Woolworth Building, the tallest building in the world. Automobiles honk. Newsboys shout that the war is ending. 8 million people woke up convinced they live at the center of the universe, the most powerful city on the planet. 31 days later, this same avenue is deserted. Streetcars pass empty, stores closed, not for lack of customers, for lack of employees still alive. A cart stops at the curb. Inside it, bodies stacked like firewood. The gravedigger does not even look back. There are still 40 addresses to visit before nightfall. I am Tom, and this is the story America spent a century trying to erase. In September, New York was burying 80 people a day. In October, 800. Cemeteries began refusing bodies. Families left their dead in apartment hallways for 5 days, waiting for someone to come collect them. And while this was happening, the authorities looked the population in the eye and said everything was under control. There is a man responsible for this lie, a face, a name, a doctor who was not an epidemiologist, who read the reports, understood the catastrophe and chose not to act. I will reveal every decision he made, every life he sacrificed for his own political career. But before we get to him, you need to know about the ship. The black hull that crossed the Atlantic carrying 9,000 soldiers, 2,000 sick, and a biological weapon more lethal than all the machine guns of the First World War combined. This story begins at a pier on the other side of the Hudson. A September afternoon, the exact moment when death docked on American soil. September 15th, 1918. Pier number 4, Hoboken, New Jersey. The USS Leviathan emerges from the Atlantic morning fog like a floating steel mountain. 290 meters long, the largest troop transport ship in the world. You are at the port and feel the pier tremble when the mooring lines are cast. 9,000 American soldiers returning from Europe. Heroes, victors. But something is wrong. The first to descend the ramp do not walk. They are carried. Improvised stretchers made of blankets and pieces of wood. The men lying on them shake with fever. Some cough a pinkish liquid that runs from the corner of their mouths. Others do not move. Of the 9,000 soldiers on board, 2,000 are sick. Some had already died during the crossing and were thrown into the sea. The port medical officers know what they are seeing. The military commanders know too. Everyone knows. And yet the order that comes down the chain of command is clear. Disperse the men. Send them home. To their cities, their neighborhoods, their families. The war needs more soldiers. There is no time for quarantine. Within 48 hours, the first civilians in New York begin to cough. What happens in the following weeks defies any mathematical model that doctors of the era knew. 100 confirmed cases in the first week, 3,000 in the second, 20,000 in the third, 50,000 before the month ends. The disease did not spread, it exploded. Each infected person transmitted to 4 or 5 others. Each of those transmitted to another 4 or 5. Hospitals that had 20 available beds received 200 patients. Corridors transformed into wards. Wards transformed into morgues. But what truly terrified doctors was not the speed. It was the pattern. Every flu that medicine knew followed a cruel but predictable logic. It killed the weak, the very old, the very young, the already sick. This flu did the opposite. It hunted the strong. Men and women between 20 and 40 years old. Workers at the peak of health. Soldiers trained to endure trenches. Mothers who had never been sick a day in their lives, these were the ones who died. Grandparents survived. Grandchildren survived. Parents did not, and the speed of death was obscene. A person woke up fine at 7 in the morning, felt a slight discomfort at 10. By 2 in the afternoon had a high fever. By 6 began coughing blood. By 11 was dead. 12 hours. Less time than it takes for the body to digest a meal. Doctors documented cases of patients who walked into the office and left in coffins before sunset. And there was a symptom that no one could explain. The victims changed color. The skin began to darken in patches around the mouth and ears. Then the blue spread across the face, the neck, the hands. A deep blue, almost purple, as if the person were drowning on dry land. And in a way they were. The doctors of 1918 had no way of knowing, but the lungs of these victims were filling with fluid. The immune system itself, in panic before an invader it did not recognize, attacked the body with such violence that it destroyed the tissues it was supposed to protect. The pulmonary alveoli, those small sacs where oxygen enters the blood, flooded with fluid and dead cells. The person drowned from within, liter by liter, breath by breath. The bluish coloration became so intense in some cases that doctors recorded something disturbing in the medical records. It was impossible to distinguish the patient's race. Whites, blacks, all acquired the same cadaverous tone before dying. The flu was so brutal that it erased even the differences that American society considered most fundamental. Why did this happen? Why did healthy adults die while the elderly survived? Why did the immune system turn against the body itself with such fury? These questions tormented scientists for nearly a century. The answer would only come in 2005 when researchers did something many considered madness. Something involving frozen corpses in the Alaskan permafrost and a high-security laboratory where the 1918 virus was brought back to life. But that revelation comes later. Now you need to understand what happened when 50,000 people fell ill at the same time in a city that was not prepared to bury even a fraction of them. And you need to know the man who had the power to act, who saw the numbers, who read the reports, and who chose to look the population of New York in the eye and lie. Royal Samuel Copeland, remember that name, Health Commissioner of New York in 1918, the man who had the power to close the city, the man who chose to do nothing. Copeland was not an epidemiologist. He was not an infectious disease specialist. He was a homeopathic doctor from Michigan who reached the most important public health position in New York through political connections and partisan favors. When the flu began to kill, he did not consult scientists. He consulted businessmen. The city was in the middle of a campaign to sell Liberty bonds, war bonds that financed the troops in Europe. Closing businesses and canceling public events meant fewer sales. Fewer sales meant negative headlines. Negative headlines meant the end of a promising political career. October 4th, 1918. Copeland calls the press and declares that the situation is under control, that New York is prepared, that there is no reason for panic. On that exact day, 443 people die in the city. The next day, 512. Copeland closes nothing. Meanwhile, 200 kilometers away, Philadelphia does the opposite. Cancels the parade in support of the troops. Closes schools, theaters, churches. Philadelphia is criticized for overreacting. Weeks later, New York has twice as many deaths per capita. The healthcare system did not collapse, it imploded. Hospitals built for 200 patients received 800. Nurses worked until they fainted and woke up to work again. Doctors contracted the disease and died in the same corridors where they tried to save lives. And when death exceeded the capacity of the living to process it, came the problem no one anticipated: the bodies. Gravediggers went on strike. The union demanded a 100% increase in wages to handle infected corpses. While the city negotiated, the dead accumulated. Bodies remained in apartments for 3, 4, 5 days. Neighbors smelled the odor and could do nothing. Cemeteries filled up. The city opened mass graves at Potter's Field, the island where New York buries its indigents. Rows of bodies without coffins, covered only with lime, stacked in trenches that looked like battlefields. When the wave finally receded, 21,000 children were orphaned. 21,000. Not in a country, in a city. Children who in September had fathers, mothers, futures. In November they had nothing. But these are the official numbers. And the official numbers lie. Because what happened in the wealthy neighborhoods of Manhattan was documented in every medical record, every certificate, every newspaper obituary. What happened in the tenements of the Lower East Side, in the alleys of Hell's Kitchen, in the back streets of Harlem, no one bothered to record. And that is where we go now, to where tragedy became extermination. Do you want to know what it was like to die invisible in 1918? Come with me to the Lower East Side. You are in a narrow hallway of a tenement, one of those 6-story buildings where immigrant families crowd into 2-room apartments. The smell is unbearable, a mixture of sweat, urine, and something sweeter, heavier, more final, the smell of decomposition. You climb the stairs and on each floor you find the same scene, doors ajar, silence. In a third-floor apartment, an entire family of Polish Jews is dead. Father, mother, 3 children. No one knows how many days. No one came to check. No doctor, no gravedigger, no city official. They did not exist to the system when they were alive. They continue not to exist now that they are dead. This was the pattern in the immigrant neighborhoods. Lower East Side, Hell's Kitchen, Harlem, Little Italy. The ghettos where Irish, Italians, Jews, blacks and Chinese lived, crammed in conditions that the Manhattan elite preferred to pretend did not exist. When the flu arrived in these neighborhoods, it did not find only vulnerable bodies. It found absent infrastructure. It found institutionalized contempt. It found people the American government never considered worthy of being counted. The official records of New York show 30,000 dead from the flu in 1918. But these records come from hospitals, from private doctors, from families who had money to call someone when the father began coughing blood. In the tenements, people died, and no one wrote it down. Historians who sifted through archives of churches, synagogues, and mutual aid societies estimate that the death rate in poor neighborhoods was 3 times higher than in wealthy neighborhoods. 3 times. This means that for every death recorded on Fifth Avenue, 3 deaths happened on the Lower East Side without anyone bothering to document them. Entire families disappeared, not metaphorically, literally. Fathers, mothers, children, grandparents, all dead within days. And since many were recent immigrants without relatives in the country, without ties to the American community, their apartments simply remained empty until the landlord broke down the door weeks later and found the bodies. How many people died this way? No one knows, no one will ever know. That is the nature of invisibility. It leaves no traces to be told. And now pull your gaze back from New York. Look at the entire country. 675,000 Americans dead. That number means nothing until you compare it. The American Civil War, the bloodiest conflict in the country's history, killed 620,000 in 4 years. The flu of 1918 killed more in less than 1 year. New York lost more citizens in 6 weeks of flu than in 4 years of World War I. American life expectancy, which had been rising for decades thanks to advances in medicine and sanitation, plummeted 12 years in 1918. 12 years. An entire generation of progress erased in months. And the world. Look at the planet. 50 million dead. Perhaps 100 million. No one knows for certain because half of humanity lived in colonies where the European powers did not bother to count native corpses. More dead than the Black Death of the 14th century. More dead than the 2 world wars combined. The greatest mortality event in documented human history. And almost no one talks about it. Why? Because the forgetting was not an accident. It was a decision. And that decision had architects. The official numbers count 30,000 dead in New York. But the official numbers lie. In the wealthy neighborhoods of Manhattan, every death was recorded. Every certificate signed, every obituary published. But cross a few blocks toward the Lower East Side, and the records simply disappear. A narrow hallway of a tenement, one of those 6-story buildings where immigrant families crowd into 2-room apartments. The smell of decomposition passes through the thin walls. In a 3rd-floor apartment, an entire family of Polish Jews is dead. Father, mother, 3 children. No one knows how many days. No doctor came to check. No gravedigger. No city official. They did not exist to the system when they were alive. They continue not to exist now that they are dead. This was the pattern. Lower East Side, Hell's Kitchen, Harlem, Little Italy. The ghettos where Irish, Italians, Jews, blacks and Chinese lived, crammed in conditions the elite preferred to ignore. When the flu arrived, it did not find only vulnerable bodies. It found absent infrastructure. It found institutionalized contempt. It found people the government never considered worthy of being counted. Historians who sifted through archives of churches, synagogues, and mutual aid societies estimate that the death rate in poor neighborhoods was 3 times higher than in wealthy neighborhoods. For every death recorded on Fifth Avenue, 3 happened on the Lower East Side without documentation. Entire families disappeared, not metaphorically, literally. Fathers, mothers, children, grandparents, dead in days. Since many were recent immigrants without relatives in the country, Their apartments remained empty until the landlord broke down the door weeks later. Now the full scale, 675,000 Americans dead. The Civil War, the bloodiest conflict in the country's history, killed 620,000 in 4 years. The flu killed more in less than 1 year. New York lost more citizens in 6 weeks than in all of World War I. American life expectancy plummeted 12 years. A generation of progress erased in months, and the planet, 50 million dead, perhaps 100 million. No one knows for certain because half of humanity lived in colonies where European powers did not count native corpses. More dead than the Black Death. More than the 2 world wars combined. The greatest mortality event in documented history. And almost no one talks about it. Because the forgetting was not an accident. It was a decision. A decision. And that decision had architects. When the flu finally receded in the winter of 1919, something extraordinary happened. Nothing. No investigation, no parliamentary commission, no trial, no memorial. 675,000 Americans dead, and the country simply turned the page. The newspapers that filled pages with daily body counts stopped mentioning the subject. The politicians who lied about the severity of the crisis were never questioned. The families who lost fathers, mothers, children quickly learned that no one wanted to hear their stories. And Royal Copeland, the man who looked New York in the eye and said everything was under control while 400 people were dying per day. In 1922, 4 years after the catastrophe, the voters of New York elected him United States Senator. He served 3 terms until his death in 1938, respected, honored, without ever answering for a single decision he made in October of 18. The lie did not destroy his career. The lie was his career. World War I received monuments in every American city. Books, films, national holidays. The flu that killed more Americans than all the wars of the 20th century combined received silence. A silence so profound that entire generations grew up without knowing that their great-grandparents lived through the greatest mortality event in human history. Why? Because wars have heroes and villains. Wars have flags and uniforms. Wars can be told as stories of courage. A pandemic has only failure, failure of authorities, failure of medicine, failure of society to protect its most vulnerable. And societies do not build memorials to their failures. 100 years passed. And then came 2020, a different virus, a different century, but the same patterns emerging like ghosts. Authorities minimizing the threat while hospitals filled. Politicians choosing the economy over lives. The wealthy fleeing to country houses, while the poor died in cramped apartments. Essential workers, almost all from humble neighborhoods, sacrificed to keep the city functioning. New York 1918 was not just a tragedy. It was a prophecy. A prophecy that no one read because no one wanted to remember. I am Tom and I need to hear from you. Why was this story erased? Why does the greatest health disaster in American history not have a single national memorial? Comment below. Because this conversation needs to happen. And before you go, one last thing. In 2005, scientists did something many considered insanity. They traveled to Alaska, exhumed bodies of victims from 1918 preserved in the permafrost, extracted fragments of lung tissue frozen for nearly 90 years, and in a high-security laboratory, resurrected the virus. They brought back to life the killer that murdered 50 million people. What they discovered about why it was so lethal, why it killed the young and spared the elderly, and whether it can return, is for the next episode.